We had now reached the summit of the loftiest crag. For some minutes the old man seemed too much exhausted to speak.
"Not long ago,"
said he at length,
"and I could have guided you on this route as well as the youngest of my sons. But about 3 years past, there happened to me an event such as never happened to mortal man, or at least such as no man ever survived to tell of. And the 6 hours of deadly terror which I then endured have broken me up body and soul. You suppose me a very old man, but I am not. It took less than a single day to change these hairs from a jetty black to white, to weaken my limbs and unstring my nerves so that I tremble at the least exertion and am frightened at a shadow. Do you know I can scarcely look over this little cliff without getting giddy?"
The little cliff upon whose edge he had so carelessly thrown himself down to rest that the weightier portion of his body hung over it. This little cliff arose, a sheer, unobstructed precipice of black, shining rock, some 15 or 1,600 feet from the world of crags beneath us. Nothing would have tempted me to within a half a dozen yards of its brink. In truth, so deeply was I excited by the perilous position of my companion that I fell at full length upon the ground, clung to the shrubs around me, and dared not even glance upward at the sky. While I struggled in vain to divest myself of the idea that the very foundations of the mountain were in danger from the fury of the winds, it was long before I could reason myself into sufficient courage to sit up and look out into the distance.
"You must get over these fancies,"
said the guide,
"for I have brought you here so that you might have the best possible view of the scene of that event I mentioned, and to tell you the whole story with the spot just under your eye. We are now close upon the Norwegian coast. The mountain upon whose top we sit is Helsegen the Cloudy. Now raise yourself up a little higher, hold on to the grass if you feel giddy, and look out beyond the belt of vapor beneath us, into the sea."
I looked dizzily and beheld a wide expanse of ocean, whose waters were so inky a hue as to bring at once to my mind the Nubian geographer's account of the Mare Tenebrarum, a panorama more deplorably desolate no human imagination can conceive. To the right and left, as far as the eye could reach, there lay outstretched lines of horridly black and beetling cliff, whose character of gloom was but the more forcibly illustrated by the surf, which reared high up against its white and ghastly crest, howling and shrieking forever. Just opposite the promontory upon whose apex we were placed, and at a distance of some 5 or 6 miles out at sea, there was visible a small, bleak-looking island. About 2 miles nearer the land arose another of smaller size, hideously craggy and barren, and encompassed at various intervals by a cluster of dark rocks. The appearance of the ocean, in the space between the more distant island and the shore, had something very unusual about it. Although at the time a strong gale was blowing landward, there was here nothing like a regular swell, but only a short, quick, angry cross-dashing of water in every direction. Of foam there was little, except in the immediate vicinity of the rocks.
"The island in the distance,"
resumed the old man,
"is called by the Norwegians Hög. The one midway is Moscow. These are the true names of the places. But why it was thought necessary to name them at all is more than either you or I can understand. Do you hear anything? Do you see any change in the water?"
We had now been about 10 minutes upon the top of Helsegen, to which we had ascended from the interior of Lofoten, so that we had caught no glimpse of the sea until it had burst upon us from the summit. As the old man spoke, I became aware of a loud and gradually increasing sound, like the moaning of a vast herd of buffaloes upon an American prairie, and at the same moment I perceived that which seamen term the chopping character of the ocean beneath us was rapidly changing into a current which set to the eastward. Even while I gazed, this current acquired a monstrous velocity. Each moment added to its speed, to its headlong impetuosity. In 5 minutes, the whole sea was lashed into ungovernable fury. The vast bed of the waters burst suddenly into frenzied convulsion, heaving, boiling, hissing, gyrating in gigantic and innumerable vortices, and all whirling and plunging on to the eastward with a rapidity which water never elsewhere assumes except in precipitous descents. In a few minutes more, the general surface grew somewhat more smooth, and the whirlpools, one by one, disappeared, while prodigious streaks of foam became apparent where none had been seen before. Suddenly, this assumed a distinct and definite existence in a circle of more than a mile in diameter. The edge of the whirl was represented by a broad belt of gleaming spray, but no particle of this slipped into the mouth of the terrific funnel, whose interior was a smooth, shining, and jet-black wall of water inclined at an angle of some 45 degrees, speeding dizzily round and round with a swaying and sweltering motion, and sending forth to the winds an appalling voice, half shriek, half roar, such as not even the mighty cataract of Niagara ever lifts up in its agony to heaven. The mountain trembled to its very base, and I threw myself upon my face, clinging to the scant herbage in an excess of nervous agitation. "This," said I at length, "this can be nothing else than the great whirlpool of the Maelström."
So it is sometimes termed. We Norwegians call it Maelström, from the island of Moskva in the Midway.
The ordinary accounts of this vortex had by no means prepared me for what I saw. That of Jonas Ramus, which is perhaps the most circumstantial of any, cannot impart the faintest conception either of the magnificence or of the horror of this scene. I am not sure from what point of view the writer in question surveyed it, but it could neither have been from the summit of Halsagen nor during a storm. Looking down from this pinnacle, I could not help smiling at the simplicity with which the honest Jonas records the anecdotes of the whales and the bears. For it appeared to me, in fact, a self-evident thing that the largest ship of the line in existence, coming within the influence of that deadly attraction, could resist it as little as a feather the hurricane. The attempts to account for the phenomenon, some of which, I remember, seemed to me sufficiently plausible in perusal, now wore a very different and unsatisfactory aspect.
You have had a good look at the world now,
said the old man.
And if you will creep round this crag so as to get in its lee and deaden the roar of the water, I will tell you a story that will convince you I ought to know something about the Maelström.
I placed myself as desired, and he proceeded.
Myself and my two brothers once owned a schooner rig schmack of about 70 tons burthen, with which we were in the habit of fishing amongst the islands beyond Moscow. In all the violent eddies at sea there is good fishing, if one only has the courage to attempt it. But among the whole of the Lofoten coastmen, we three were the only ones who made a regular business of going out to the islands, as I tell you. The usual grounds are a great way lower down to the southward. There fish can be gotten at all hours without much risk, and therefore these places are preferred. The choice spots over here amongst the rocks not only yield the finest variety, but in far greater abundance, so that we often got in a single day what more timid of the craft could not get together in a week. We kept a smack in a cove about 5 miles higher up the coast than this, and it was our practice in fine weather to take advantage of the 15-minute slack to push across the main channel of the Maelström far above the pool, and then drop down upon anchorage somewhere where the eddies are not so violent. We never set out this expedition without a steady side wind for going and coming, one that we felt sure would not fail us before our return, and we seldom made a miscalculation upon this point. Twice during 6 years we were forced to stay at night at anchor on account of the dead calm, which is a rare thing indeed. And once we had to remain underground nearly a week, starving to death, owing to a gale which blew up shortly after our arrival and made the channel too boisterous to be thought of. Upon this occasion, we should have been driven out to sea, if it had not been that we drifted into one of the innumerable cross-currents which drove under the lee of Thilmen, where, by good luck, we brought up. I could not tell you the 20th part of the difficulties we encountered on the grounds, but we made shift always to run the gauntlet of the Maelström itself without accident, although at times my heart had been in my mouth when we happened to be a minute or so behind before the slack. The wind sometimes was not as strong as we thought at its starting, and then we made rather less way than we could wish, while the current rendered the smack unmanageable. My eldest brother had a son 18 years old, and I had 2 stout boys of my own. These would have been great assistants at such times, in using the sweeps as well as afterward in fishing, but somehow we had not the heart to let the young ones get into the danger. For after all is said and done, it was a horrible danger, and that is the truth. It is now 3 years since what I am going to tell you occurred. It was on the 10th day of July, a day which the people of this part of the world will never forget, for it was one in which blew the most terrible hurricanes that ever came out of the heavens. And yet all the morning, and indeed until late in the afternoon, there was a gentle and steady breeze from the southwest, so that the oldest seaman among us could not have foreseen what was to follow. The 3 of us, my 2 brothers and myself, had crossed over into the islands about 2:00 p.m., and had soon nearly loaded the smack with fine fish, which we were more plenty that day than we had ever known them. It was just 7 by my watch, when we weighed and started for home, so as to make the worst of the storm at slack water, which we knew would be at 8. We set out with a fresh wind in a starboard quarter, and for some time spanked along at a great rate, never dreaming of danger, for indeed we saw not the slightest reason to apprehend it. All at once we were taken aback by a breeze from over Helsingen. This was most unusual, and I began to feel a little uneasy, without exactly knowing why. We put the boat on the wind, but could make no headway at all for the eddies, and I was at the point of proposing to return to the anchorage when, looking astern, we saw the whole horizon covered with a singular copper-colored cloud that rose with the most amazing velocity. In the meantime, the breeze that had headed us off fell away, and we were dead becalmed, drifting about in every direction. The state of things did not last long enough to give us time to think about it. In less than a minute, the storm was upon us. In less than 2, the sky was entirely overcast, and it became suddenly so dark we could not see each other in the smack. Such a hurricane as then blew, it is folly to attempt describing. The oldest seaman in Norway never experienced anything like it. We had let our sails go by the run before it cleverly took us, but at the first puff, both our masts went by the board as if they had been sawed off, the mainmast taking with it my youngest brother, who had lashed himself to it for safety. Our boat was the lightest feather of a thing that ever sat upon the Wasser. It had a complete flush deck, with only a small hatch near the bow, and this hatch it had always been our custom to batten down when about to cross the Ström by way of precaution against the chopping seas. But for this circumstance we should have found it at once, for we lay entirely buried for some moments. How my elder brother escaped destruction I cannot say, for I had never had an opportunity of ascertaining. For my part, as soon as I had let the foresail run, I threw myself on the deck, with my feet against the narrow gunwale of the bow, and with my hands grasping a ringbolt near the foot of the foremast. It was mere instinct that prompted me to do this, for I was much too flurried to think. For some moments we were completely deluged, and as I say, and all this time I held my breath and clung to the bolt. When I could stand it no longer, I raised myself up upon my knees, still keeping holds with my hands, and thus got my head clear. Presently our little boat gave herself a little shake, just as a dog does in coming out of the Wasser, and thus rid herself of the seas.